Hello, welcome. All right. So we're doing the 20s assignment, the Roaring 20s, and I'm glad to have you. Are there any questions or comments before I start? You sure? All right, I hope you're doing well. Let's go to the assignment, okay? So let's see here. That's notes for the assignment. Let me find, where is it? I have it opened. Bear with me here. There it is. Okay, so did you have a chance to read the introduction, perhaps? Let's take a look at it, okay? While such depictions might have been exaggerated in so much as they embodied the young generation of the 20s, the following caricatures are often discovered in documentaries on the topic. Young adults dancing to jazz music, women entering the public scene unabashedly with bold defiance toward Victorian norms, white Americans flocking to Harlem to imbibe the Harlem Renaissance, bootleggers smuggling alcohol to a large segment of the population in audacious defiance of the prohibition of alcohol, the stock market and American economy thriving amidst a popular culture of instant gratification and consumerism, and popular leaders in government and entertainment broadcasting their wild lifestyle. This popular image of the Roaring 20s, however accurate, was perceived by some conservatives and self-appointed observers of their generation through multiple sources. What approximates modern polls began to be seriously undertaken during this decade, and some results pointed toward this image. From 23 to 24, a report was carried out in Muncie, Indiana, via interviews, questionnaires, access to legal records, and other semi-sophisticated methods. The results rendered the self-appointed commission to conclude that Victorian ethics, right, had been boldly defied by the youth, particularly by the women, because of the double standard on sex. They were more concerned about the women. That year in Muncie alone, 30 young women had been arrested for, quote, sex crimes, and half the young unmarried women interviewed admitting to having had premarital sex. Reading love letters, they were horrified by the manner in which young women wrote frankly about topics sexual in nature. On the movie screen, leading women seemed to evolve from Victorian-like figures like Mary Pickford to the confused, but somewhat promiscuous Clara Bow, to the femme fatale like Louise Brooks throughout the 20s on the big screen. Not to mention their lives off the screen was captured by the press, and many of them lived a pretty fast lifestyle. Advertisements of the 20s, newspapers, popular fiction writers, motion pictures portrayed this new woman declaring independence from Victorian morality, and Coco Chanel constructed a physically verifiable image of her flapper attire. So at any rate, let's see here. Then the Harlem Renaissance, right? The NAACP and Academia, Broadway, and theatrical associations, the media and radio broadcast proliferated its influence across the nation. Writing and other academic contests were encouraged and publicized. Jazz music was listened to by over 1 million viewers over the airwaves, and African-American musicals like Shuffle Along toured the states and took the nation by storm. Urban centers finally embraced electrification, so evening dance halls, cabarets, and theaters ran with the jazz culture to create profitable, vibrant nightlife. African-American writers like Langston Hughes and entertainers like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong became household names. One of the premier divas of the era was astonishingly an African-American woman named Josephine Baker. Her biography, however, betrays the extent to which there were limitations to popular WASP acceptance of African-Americans even during this Renaissance. Then the image of the bootlegger in the popular narrative, Al Capone, reached notoriety. Let's see here. The bootlegging was garnering $2 billion a year, and that between 20 and 22, there were over 3,500 civil and 65,000 criminal hearings pertaining to alleged defiance of prohibition. and that 1/10 of the National Guard was caught taking bribes to permit the transportation of alcohol. By the way, with those stats, there was about a 60% conviction rate, 60. That at its peak, the federal government employed only 3,000 agents to enforce prohibition. They only grabbed from the budget $2 million to enforce it. That some elected officials openly refused to enforce it, like like Mr. Hale Thompson, the governor of Chicago, said he wasn't going to enforce prohibition, and testified to the degree to which this generation defied a federal law and constitutional amendment. As for the image of the roaring prosperity during the 20s, several typical indicators seem to support this image. According to historian George Moss, the volume of industrially produced products in the U.S. nearly doubled from 23 to 29, termed by writer F. Scott Fitzgerald as the greatest, gaudiest spree in history. The American economy experienced a particular boom in private ownership of cars, homes, and non-essential or luxury products. Automobile construction rose 225%. Car ownership more than doubled. Cities with 250,000 or more inhabitants grew by 8 million. And suburban growth coincided with an increase in home ownership. As for the development of consumption in non-essential industries, movie theaters alone grossed over 50 million per week in 25 alone. In 28, American homes contained 15 million irons, 6.8 million vacuum cleaners, 5 million washers, 4.5 million toasters, and 750,000 electric refrigerators. This is all possible because Americans could now purchase on credit. And because, as historian Larry Schweikart contends, per capita income had increased from 522 to 716 per year between 21 and 29 in real terms. And then the Warren G. Harding administration seemed to be like a microcosm of this kind of anything goes, hedonistic decade of the 20s. He had a lot of scandals, his administration did. He himself, as well as his cabinet, flaunted prohibition strictures with regular poker nights enjoyed with cigars and whiskey. His cabinet had an actual address in Washington, D.C., to which bribes were regularly paid and accepted. There was a guy named Jess Smith who accepted those bribes, and he mysteriously died when he became under investigation. And a lot of people believe he was murdered by someone in Harding's administration. He was caught having an affair on his wife, that's Warren G. Harding. And the Teapot Dome scandal, the Department of the Navy gave over lands to the Department of the Interior, which in turn gave the rights to extracting the oil from that land to friends who own private oil companies. And those friends in turn gave the leader of the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, like $400,000 as a kickback. And so at any rate, you're gonna finally get, under Warren G. Harding's administration, the first prison sentences for cabinet members, constituted merely the most publicly recognizable amongst multiple scandals. Relatively young and healthy coming into office, Warren G. Harding further epitomized the popular narrative of this generation in dying in office. I think he died at like 58, but he looked very young and robust when he was elected just 3 years prior. And he lived quickly. He lived a fast lifestyle, was stressed over his scandals, and was in poor health 3 years later, and ended up dying in San Francisco before his term even expired. So kind of as a microcosm of the 20s, with all going loosely and it culminating in the Great Depression. During this tumultuous decade, Americans became very polarized on multiple fronts between those who seemed to embrace the changes of the 20s and those who were terrified of said changes. Moreover, those embracing these changes often resided in urban areas, not always, but the dichotomy is pretty much true, supposedly, while much of the strength of the traditionalists fighting such changes lived in more rural regions. Typical fronts in which this cultural war was fought included the following: struggle between acceptance of or opposition to this new woman, the battle over alcohol consumption. Of course, the traditionalists were against alcohol, and the moderns, as they called themselves, embraced it. Tolerance of ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans and immigrants. versus a xenophobic opposition to their influence over things, quote, American. And the xenophobic side were the traditionalists. And remember, you could be a traditionalist and just take on one facet of this culture war, and it's certainly not all of them. So that's, I wanted to qualify that. America's consumer craze, so consumerism, split Americans in this culture war, and the teaching of macrospecies evolutionary theory in public schools of Charles Darwin. So what I want you to do, if you would, please, is please type at least one page addressing any one of the following questions of your choosing. Please cite at least one source. Online sources and video documentaries are perfectly fine, and use data and logic to defend your answer. So you're just choosing one of these, okay? So firstly, you could choose, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms? So I have here, for instance, economic empowerment, an increase in the number of young ladies going to college, the media, the automobile, Freud, postmodernism, etc. Your second choice, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion for African Americans? And I find that to be a very interesting topic as well. Number three, why do you think Prohibition failed? Or number four, to what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified? All right. And your choice for number five, to what extent did hedonism, living for instant gratification or pleasure, or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the Roaring 20s contribute to the Great Depression? All right. So what I want to do is I want to do some notes on each of these questions, if you don't mind. All right. But remember, at any time, if you want to chime in and ask me a question, or if you have a comment, please let me know, okay? And I'd be happy to hear from you. So let's see here. So with women, right? You know, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote by 1920, the rise of the new woman, etc. They didn't just suddenly spontaneously erupt, right? So many things in history happen organically. They evolve. They slowly grow, right, and accumulate. And I think this is another case in point. If you look in the 1800s, you could see changes that came about that empowered women. For one, which I don't have on here, and I think I'm going to add to it, is empowerment via the courts. So, for instance, in the 1840s, especially during like the gold rush, etc., from that period onward, you had a lot of men abandon their wives heading westwardly. And in doing so, they provoked a lot of women to take their husbands to court and sue for divorce, sue for custody of their children. And that's when they began earning that certain rights. Because remember, we follow English common law that certain rights accrued by American citizens are to be gained in the courts incrementally, decision by decision. And so in the 1840s, wives gained rights with child custody, and divorce autonomy, the ability to sue for divorce on account of abandonment of their husbands. For instance, in the 1870s, there were some important cases with women's right to individual property. And this was versus coverture, which we had inherited from England. By coverture, right, a woman's legal, her legal identity, her property were swallowed up by the husband once she got married. So whatever she inherited from her father became her husband's once she got married. This began to evolve and erode in the 1870s as women began the right to be able to hold on to, retain their property, inherit property, etc. So I think that that's important to remember, is empowerment via the courts. And then also reforms, right? Is with reforms, right? The idea is it's seen as gaining political experience and collective self-confidence. So if you look at, right, the benevolent societies from the time prior to the Civil War, women began taking on issues like slavery, child labor, versus alcohol consumption, for schools, for public school systems, for prison reform, etc. And so when women began doing this, right, there were health movements of wide variety. And so they began gaining familiarity with things like the petition, boycotts, speeches, given public speeches, right? And what I mean by the petition, I mean the formally getting thousands of signatures and then addressing a legislator, addressing legislative bodies, all right? Disseminating propaganda. And then also, right, especially when you see it with Frances Willard's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is they began entering private saloons. They would sing, they would read speeches from the Bible, verses. They would petition the clients, the customers, to sign pledges to never drink again. And then in cases like Carrie Nation, she was a character. She would actually destroy property. Look into her. She's an interesting woman. And so at any rate, they're gaining political experience and doing these things, right? So that it can morph into fighting for their own rights. So in leading the way, you had women like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wasn't an American, she was a Brit, but she wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women at the time of our independence, or about the time of our constitutional formation in the 1770s or 80s. You have Sarah Stearns and Julia B. Nelson in the Great Lakes area fighting for women's political enfranchisement. You have Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Blackwell, the first to gain degrees, college degrees. And along with that, right, is you have the beginning of college integration. And at the forefront of that was Oberlin College in Ohio, were the first to famously accept women, young women, as well as men. And not to mention, a lot of these college educated women all the way through the 20s went to female institutions, female colleges. And I'm probably going to butcher this. It's a strange spelling. It's something like that. Bryn Mawr was a very prestigious, that spell check's not helping me. So sorry. I don't know if it's a U. That didn't work either. But anyway, you get the point. And you have women oftentimes pertaining to Marxist organizations who politically petitioned and had great political careers, even if they were on the fringe of the far left of the political spectrum, like Victoria Woodhull. It was kind of seen as a joke by mainstream America, but she ran for president in the Gilded Age as a woman. So you have Victoria Woodhull, you have Mother Jones, who was a Russian woman who ended up being deported for her radical leanings and was deported during World War I, right about the end of it. But still, you have women making a lot of noise, right? And then, of course, with the 19th Amendment, you have, my goodness, also leading the way was Seneca Falls from your previous class time frame, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, or was it 49? Shame on me. In the late 1840s, the Seneca Falls Convention, and that's where you're going to get Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, etc. And so you look at some of these names, and like I said, if you wanted to just do a little Google search of some of these names, very pivotal in paving the way for women. And then the National Women's Association by Alice Paul was huge. Alice Paul took very bold steps for women in their enfranchisement to be accepted fully as citizens, particularly with the right to vote and run for office, etc. Alice Paul was huge. So all this had preceded the new woman of the 1920s, not to mention the experience of World War I, and kind of like World War II, but it hasn't been put on par with World War II as far as the impact. Is women entered the public sphere in the war industries because the doughboys were overseas fighting. So they started gaining wages outside the home, gaining some autonomy, gaining some experience and camaraderie with one another, working in the factories, etc., together. And then not to mention with the Industrial Revolution, the increase in white collar or / pink collar jobs. And with the pink collar jobs, I mean like telephone operators, secretaries, and other clerical jobs connected to this new industrializing economy. All right. So all of those factor in as well. And you got to remember also, it's like with academic progress is, let's see here, urbanization, colleges open to women. See, I did Bryn Mawr again with the wrong spelling, sorry. But look at this. In the 1920s, the number of young kids of adolescents and around 18 and to their early 20s that were going to college more than tripled. It would tripled. And a lot of that increase constituted women, young women now for the first time going to college. And that's, the idea that women they're able to prolong uh, a transitional stage between childhood and adulthood. Because from the Puritan times, right, oftentimes you were expected to grow up to marry at a scarily young age. I mean, there were states that gave the year of a permission for a woman to supposedly decide whom to marry at 10 years old, 10-year-old girl. And so girls have been expected to grow up very quickly. And now this affords a transitional time, right? Adolescence, if you will. That whole notion of adolescence is pretty modern. Before they have to choose to marry and settle down and so forth. So marriages and adult responsibilities were postponed, not to mention, right, about a quarter of the population to a larger third of the population remained single, unmarried. So fewer women were getting married in the 1920s. All right, remaining, because oftentimes, as it states in our textbook, women were making a decision for economic independence or marriage, one or the other. So oftentimes they chose, a career rather than getting married, because it still was culturally expected, even with this revolutionary of mores for women, it was still expected for them to stop working once they got married, especially if they were middle class or higher. It was a status thing for the men to be the sole breadwinners for their wives and kids. So more of them were remaining unmarried. And then also, remember, however, as far as them being, economically sufficient, that is still a question that's contested. And our textbook contends that that's not the case, doesn't it? If you've had a chance to read from the textbook, I got a stat here somewhere contending that women in the mid 1920s were gaining about $22 per week, when the average cost of living, depending on region, right, and city that you were living in, et cetera, with the prices of everything, was from $20 to $25 per week. So women were just at the cusp of self-sufficiency economically, but not quite there. So sometimes, in some cases, women decided to marry partially out of economic concerns for economic security, for a second salary. All right. So all this is happening. And then you had, in addition to you have the ideological side to history, right? The history of ideas. And you had World War I disillusionment. You have what was known as the lost generation during the 1920s, like Hemingway, that went and lived in Paris in France. And they wrote jadedly about war, how awful it is, and how it does not live up to its romantic image. So you had some people who would become disillusioned with war and the idea, not just World War I disillusionment, right? But remember, during World War I, we were to fight a war to end all wars. We were to fight a war to make the world safe for democracy, even institute a new world order with Wilson's 14 points, right? And so hence progressivism began to lose steam by the end of World War I. people were becoming disillusioned with trying to improve the world and perfect it. They felt like the world was still riddled with hypocrisy. So is this a reason for which women kind of really let go in the 1920s and insisted on, if nothing else, social independence, if not complete economic independence, that to be the arbiters of their own destiny, as far as how they lived their daily lives, etc. And Freud, right, as stated in the textbook, is there was popular abuse or misinterpretation to his notions of the id and the superego. Is, from what I can recall, and we're talking about the 90s and reading Freud as a student, from what I believe to have remembered, is Freud mentioned a balance, right? That you follow your appetite, your id, your natural animal impulses, if you will, that he called them, your instincts. You follow them to a degree, right? But you also have to have a role of your superego, your internalized mom and dad, your conscience that tells you, no, don't do that. There'll be repercussions for that. That's societally frowned upon, et cetera, et cetera. So to people in the 20s, right, there were oftentimes these arguments that were openly conveyed in the press, et cetera, is that if you don't give in to your id, you're just going to repress everything. And he did mention that if you don't sufficiently give in to your id, right, his psychological theory, if you will. Remember, like he talked about the different stages of development, the oral stage, the anal stage, and they represented like creativity, intimacy, etc. Right? That if you don't give in to those urges sufficiently, and your superego becomes a tyrant over your personal behavior, he thought that you were going to it was going to manifest itself in ugly ways in the future as an adult. I think of like, passive aggression and so forth. That squashed id was going to manifest itself in unhealthy ways with your relationships, with your behavior, etc. And you're going to build neuroses from it. So hence people, instead of looking at it in the sense of a balance, which I believe Freud was trying to convey, because I certainly don't remember anything from his writings that said all will be well if you totally give in to your id. But people contended in the 20s popularly that if you don't sufficiently give in to your id, that it's going to manifest itself in ugly ways. All right. And then postmodernism was big as a philosophical and artistic movement at this time. And with postmodernism, the part that I try to convey, because it's been a long time since I've studied postmodernism, is that the notion of moral relativism, that there is no such thing as right or wrong, that everything is relative. So did that have something to do with this 20s generation going wild, if you will? All right, so are there any questions about number one? I'm hoping that should you choose number one, that I helped you a little bit. Gave you some ideas from which you could look into things online. Number two, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion for African Americans? Evidence for popularity and exposure, right? There is evidence of a crossover. Because remember, there were, like in Harlem, et cetera, especially, which Remember, Harlem was an enclave, especially from the great migration of 1.5 million Southern African Americans moving up into the North around the time of World War I in the 19 teens. They formed enclaves, right? Like a Chinatown, an ethnically homogenous area of the city. Harlem became the most famous in New York for African Americans. And you have, literary and artistic musical organizations of African Americans in Harlem, no doubt, a plethora of them, in fact. But during the Harlem Renaissance, you have evidence of them making it, for instance, like to Broadway, whereby you could make the argument that, okay, wow, now they have the entire white nation's attention, right? So you have people like Bessie Smith, Josephine Baker. Bessie Smith was a singer. Josephine Baker was a dancer and singer and entertainer, right? Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. The musical Shuffle Along. Many white Americans were familiar with these figures and this play. Many of them paid money to listen to them. So now they're crossing over into mainstream popularity. The writings of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen were read by the general public. You look at sales of their books and their poems, etc., and accessibility at different shows broadcasted from Harlem. There's evidence that the work of these Harlem Renaissance artists had the attention of the American public. However, as stated in the book, Harlem itself remained segregated and underdeveloped. A lot of white Americans who traveled to Harlem to experience the Renaissance likened it to a term they used back then, slumming. We're going to check out what these, quote, Negro artists have to offer, but we're going to leave as soon as possible. Kind of likening it as a 1920s version of modern Vegas, right? A place where you can go and whatever wild, whatever inhibitions that you let go of, whatever enjoyment that you partake in, you contend that it's anomalous. It's out of the ordinary. It's not typical of you. It's just a wild weekend that you forget about and don't talk about afterward. So there's an idea, right, that with Harlem itself, there was projection that was going on, that Americans did not want to admit how much they enjoyed it. In particular, right, the projection as it pertained to things sexual. Because if you look at Josephine Baker, right, that poor lady had public pressure to be a sex symbol for white America. That's where she sold her tickets. That's where her fame erupted. Her famous banana dance and other dances and entertainment that were very sexually suggestive in nature. That's what skyrocketed her. But at the same time, right, white America could just simply project and say, well, that's not really us, right? But that's the whole Sambo image, the very image that African Americans are trying to refute, right? The happy-go-lucky, ignorant, animal-like, sexual beast African. They wanted to hurl themselves into that, enjoy it, and then leave Harlem. There's evidence for that phenomenon happening. So to whatever extent that may be true, that would arguably constitute a limitation to the Harlem Renaissance, because the Harlem Renaissance, right, was to try to earn popular institutional respect, tolerance, inclusion for African Americans. So it was needless to say, included within their aims was to try to refute the Sambo image. Say, hey, look how capable of creating culture we are. Look how intelligent we are. Look how talented we are. Look how creative we are. Josephine Baker became so disgusted at times with how she was treated in America. She would go to entertain somewhere and they wouldn't even allow her to eat in the restaurant or to stay in the hotel. So she fell in love with a French producer and she ended up moving to France. She was invited back on an occasion in New York, and she, in a play, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the play, but she fell in love with the other leading actor, not in real life, but in the play, right? She was projected as a Black woman, as having a romantic relationship with a leading white actor. And the American press did not take kindly to it. And she has quotes whereby she says, "No wonder I moved to France. The Americans just aren't progressive enough. They're not ready for me. They're not ready for this Harlem Renaissance." And then themes of artistic expression. I find it very interesting with Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and Claude McKay, is you have books like Not Without Laughter, Home to Harlem, some of these books that were written by these authors. And they have a protagonist who is an embodiment of the refutation of the Sambo image. This Black leading protagonist is articulate, intelligent, ambitious, self-controlled, right? Ambitious. And then there is oftentimes in these books a friend, another leading character, who does seem to kind of, throughout much of the book, portray the Sambo image. A happy-go-lucky Black man who wants to chase white women, drink, go to a speakeasy, dance to jazz music, live for the day, doesn't have much ambition for the future, and seeing beyond the, instant gratification. But as the characters evolve and as the plot unravels, right, you find the leading protagonist becoming disillusioned with white America and learning the simple fact that it doesn't matter how much he imitates the white man and how much he lives up to the white man's standards, that white America cannot get past his Black skin and appearance. so that he begins to become disillusioned by the end of the book, no longer wants the acceptance of white America, becomes ashamed of himself for having been ashamed of his own black skin, and begins to see the wisdom, the hidden wisdom in the Sambo-like character connected to him. The Sambo-like character ends up becoming like the proverbial court jester. On the surface seems like the clown, but ends up spitting forth some great wisdom by the end of the book. And you realize, wow, there was a lot more to him than just simply wanting to chase white women and drink and dance, etc. He was aware of everything that the leading actor, the leading protagonist, was not aware of to begin with. So I find that fascinating. And so you find that in the writings and in the lives of people like Langston Hughes and Count Colin, whereby they have almost this this identity crisis, where they're torn between wanting to prove to white America that they're just as sophisticated, just as civilized as they are, but being ashamed of the fact that they are ashamed or had been ashamed of their black skin, and saying, you know what? No, come to think of it, I'm proud of being black. I'm proud of being of African heritage. To me, it's just fascinating. And Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston lived under a rich white woman who gave them allowances to live so that they could just write and not have to have a day job. But then supposedly she began to try to dictate to them what they wrote and how they wrote it. And they both quickly grew very perturbed by that, because they wanted to feel free to write what they wanted. And then Claude McKay has a poem, If We Must Die. And it's very powerful. It likens the African-American man to a rooster in a hen house. And the slaughterer, the white man, is coming in to slaughter him and devour him. And he's cornered in the pen. And he says, if I'm going to go down, I might as well go down swinging against the white establishment. So with If We Must Die, you also have Paul Robeson, who is a singer, had a real deep baritone voice, became famous as a crossover singer. But Paul Robeson, he took a trip to Moscow after the Bolshevik Revolution, when Russia was Soviet, right? And he conveyed rather quickly his sympathies for communism. Well, the American government wouldn't let him back from Russia. So you put some of these individuals together, right? And you have concocted together a generic term utilized in the Harlem Renaissance as the New Negro. And the New Negro didn't necessarily want to integrate and to become accepted by white America, because he felt that that was impossible, and that the only way it was possible is if for self-abnegation, for the African American to just strip himself from everything that he truly was, to try to gain the acceptance of white America. And to the New Negro, it wasn't worth it. Acceptance at the cost of losing yourself was not worth it. So the New Negro, was not in line with W.E.B. Du Bois' hope for integration. W.E.B. Du Bois thought that the most talented, most intelligent, most successful, and well-educated 1/10 of African-American men could win over the respect of white America. So in many ways, right, Langston Hughes lived that, trying to demonstrate that he was amongst the talented 10th. His protagonist in his novels represented that talented 10th, quote, Negro. But again, by the end of his life, by the end of his writings, he questioned it and said, you know what, maybe there is some truth about this new Negro. Maybe we shouldn't care about integration and acceptance, because it should never come at the cost of killing who we are, or abnegating or denying who we are. And then also at that time, right, you had a Black is Beautiful movement by characters like Marcus Garvey, who wanted a Back to Africa campaign for African Americans, contending, don't even try to be integrated by white America. You're wasting your breath. Let's all go back to Africa. Let's be proud of and embrace things African. So separatism, no less so than the later Nation of Islam. Okay. All right, and then number 3, why do you think prohibition failed? If you choose that one. Is there evidence that it wasn't really popularly embraced or espoused? That one's hard. The more I read, the more confused I get on the topic, to be honest. Because you look at these demographics, these movements right here, all of them supported prohibition. The populists, when we talked about the populists, the small cash crop farmers, right? The unreconstructed South, yes, they made this into a racial thing. And they wanted to make sure that African American men could not have access to alcohol with their newfound freedom, if not power, because that power had been taken from them at the end of Reconstruction. And you had some famous cases that got just ridiculous publicity about Black men getting drunk and assaulting white women. The progressives embraced prohibition by and large. The Methodist and Baptist and other evangelical or Protestant denominations of Christianity very strongly embraced prohibition. The Anti-Saloon League was huge, a very strong lobbyist power, the Anti-Saloon League. Wayne Wheeler wielded power very well, knew political infighting tactics very well. You had traveling evangelists like Billy Sunday for prohibition. And you had congressmen like Representative Richmond Hobson of Alabama. But nevertheless, they fought for decades to finally get this passed. All right. And they finally do. But then what about inadequate enforcement? So that's up to you to look into that. To what extent do you think that it was that this new amendment, the 18th Amendment, right, and by way of the Volstead Act, specified that anything made of 0.5% alcohol cannot be manufactured, cannot be sold or bought or transported. So let's see here. Inadequate enforcement, only $2 million and only 1,500 federal agents with a quote concurrent help from the states. Well, some of the states gave very lukewarm support. as you see, most infamously, Illinois, with its famous city of Chicago. So you look at that and you think, well, they didn't have the means. They truly didn't have the means to enforce prohibition very successfully. But at the same time, as I mentioned, from 1920 to 1922, there were 65,000 criminal hearings with a 60% conviction rate. So for the first 2 years, you can make the argument that it was carried out rather well. A lot of people, were arrested. But those very high numbers also indicate that deviance from the law was widespread. All right. What about economically? Is, remember, you had the income tax as a substitute now, because now, for a long time in American history, the excise tax on alcoholic beverages was one of the main moneymakers of our country for our federal government. And now that went away during Prohibition. They have no way of bringing in income. It was at least partially offset, if not completely offset, economically, purely economically, by the new amendment. Shame on me not recalling if it was 16th or 17th, for a direct income tax. All right. But the lobbyist powers, look at the powers of the United States Brewers Association. And, Anheuser-Busch, right? Pabst, Rupert, Schmidt. These were very powerfully, constructed, wealthy, oftentimes German brewers. And not to stereotype, but a lot of the most famous distillers, the names were Jewish. And so then Prohibition is going to take on an ethnic dimension as well, whereby some people are going to oppose alcohol consumption simply out of an xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-minority stance. But you look at sheer numbers, you have a large percentage of first and second generation new immigrants, right? By the 1920s. German, Italian, Irish, Slavic, etc. And by and large, a lot of these new immigrants culturally, as Eastern Orthodox, as Roman Catholic, culturally and religiously, they historically were more open to alcohol consumption. I mean, the Eucharist, right, of the Catholic Church, the communion, they use real wine. There's more of a tolerant attitude toward the moderate consumption, at least the Catholic Church, right? At least moderate consumption of alcohol. So in areas, right, with a large Irish and Italian demographic like New York, young guys like a young Franklin Roosevelt are going to teeter back and forth and try to prolong how long they could wait until taking a public stance on whether they were dry or wet, because you found that dichotomy happening in the States. A lot of the new immigrants and their second generation offspring were wets, embraced, the right of people to drink, to consume alcohol. Because remember, to a lot of people, it wasn't about drunkenness and revelry. To a lot of people, it was about individual freedom. It was about the fact that the political realm was trying to control the social realm, legislating morality. That's controversial, even and including in the United States, perhaps especially included in the United States, where even if we don't really live up to it, libertarian rhetoric has survived very well, right? Government, don't tread on me. Don't tell me how to live my personal life. A lot of those who were for prohibition not only were anti-immigrant, but also were corporate owners like the Rockefellers, Frederick Winslow Taylor, Henry Ford. And for at least partially a very practical reason is they didn't want their workers drunk or hungover. They thought sober workers would do better work. So there were a myriad of motives behind this, right? Prohibition, either supporting it or not supporting it. But absolutely, you have to remember that legislating something in the social realm of what people privately do in their own home or in a private saloon, that's almost always been controversial in American political tradition, in American history. And that to some people, right, it wasn't about so much love of alcohol, it was about personal freedom being, curtailed, cut short. And you have to remember the alleged culture of the 20s. When we talked about the new woman and young youth culture and jazz culture, etc., they very much, rebelled in many ways, very conspicuously, against Victorian norms. Because remember, Victorian era had especially the middle class beholden to notions of propriety, especially when it came to anything to do with sex. So to adhere to Judeo-Christian, conservative, old traditional notions of right and wrong, what is proper and what is improper. And not to mention the role, the cultural grip that that Hollywood had. Hollywood arguably took the country by storm in the 20s. And like I said, they not only were thumbing their nose at Victorian norms in the pictures, but outside the pictures as well. The well-covered, press-covered lives of a lot of the Hollywood stars of the 1920s depicted them as living a very, for lack of a better adjective, uninhibited, wild lifestyle. Errol Flynn, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, etc. Louise Brooks. So at any rate, so by all means, look into that if you're interested in that one. And then number 4, to what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified? And that's just very broad. And so, especially in doing one page, I would recommend that you pick one field or just a couple fields instead of all of them, as far as, biting off more than you want to chew. Not that then you can chew, but then you want to chew for a simply one-page assignment. All right. So you could take on, concern over the new woman and the youth culture and the jazz age. You could take on concern about Darwinism taught in the schools by way of the Scopes trial, SCOPES, the Scopes trial. You could take on issues of, ethnic minorities and immigrants with the rise of the KKK I mean, obviously, if you go that route, I would imagine that you're going to contend that the traditionalist concerns were not reasonable or justified. So hence, right, it's one thing to try to defend the KKK, and I say that laughingly, which of course I would never do and would never expect a student to do. But maybe, you know, to an extent with something a little less controversial than that, taking on Darwinian theory in the schools with the Scopes trial, taking on the new woman, taking on alcohol. So I would confine yourselves, just me subjectively, I would confine yourself to one, maybe two areas of combat in the culture war if you choose number 4. Otherwise, it's just too broad for a one-page assignment. So look at one of the areas of combat in this culture war and decide, you know what, in this particular area, I think they were justified in being concerned. Or like I said, pick a route like the xenophobic fight, which seems objectively wrong today, and stick with that one and say, I don't think the traditionalist concerns were reasonable or justified. Because that one is pretty broad. I don't like how broadly I framed question 4. Okay. So I want to look and see where we finished with the questions. I want to see if I have the test available. Can I do this? Bear with me here, okay? Okay, so can you see test 2 along with me? All right, let me know if you can't. So look at 31. Traditionalists oppose one or several of the following perceived cultural changes of the 20s: rebellion against Victorian norms of sexuality and propriety, consumerism, hedonism, embrace of secularism and Darwinian theory, and alcoholism and jazz culture, often associated with non-WASP minorities. So that one's true. I meant that one to be true.
Mr. Cowell,
Yes.
we can only see your files. We cannot see the exact test.
Oh, shoot. Okay, let me try this again now. Now that I have it open, let me try one more time, okay? How about now?
Yeah, it works now.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
it works.
great. Thank you. Sorry about that. All right, so I just went over number 31, and I intend that one to be true. You look for the one that's false about the new woman. Like Lois Long and Louise Brooks, she seemed to unapologetically flaunt sexual double standards. Absolutely. C, some feminist movement leaders bemoan the possibility of women losing public respect. Yes. To some of those that were serious about, you know, the suffragettes, etc., right? And for the feminist movement, some of them thought that the flapper, the new woman of the 1920s, was losing respect for women, whether they intended to or not. D, women were increasingly attending college and extending their adolescence before marriage. Yes, we mentioned that. But look at B. Most women for the first time became economically independent. That is not necessarily true. According to our own textbook, it's not true. Women still were having to choose. And some feeling as if they had no choice, needing to get married for economic help. All right. Number 33, the 18th and 20th Amendments pertain to prohibition of the manufacturing, sale, or consumption of alcoholic beverages It was depicted as having attained limited success. Nevertheless, it was depicted as nearly impossible to enforce and tied in class to a mass deviance image of the Roaring Twenties and to the sociological question of legislating morality. That is the one I intend for you to pick. That's what I tried to convey today. All right, 34, the Harlem Renaissance. You're looking for the one that does not fit. It was claimed in class that crossover events, right, gave the Harlem Renaissance a good start. Absolutely. And I mentioned that. B, the new Negro was identified in class with a lack of desire to integrate into WASP America, with a pride in blackness, with Marxist goals, and sometimes violent means even sanctioned. Yes. And C, Harlem itself burgeoned into a multicultural, modern, culturally avant-garde, socioeconomically white-collar city? No. Remember, I stated the opposite. Number 35, the life of Harlem Renaissance entertainer Josephine Baker was cited as evidence for widespread WASP acceptance of African Americans and of African American culture during the Roaring Twenties? No. Remember, I used her as an example. Remember her moving to France as an example of the limitations of white acceptance of African Americans and African American culture. So no. 36, Langston Hughes and Countee Colin's works and lives are depicted in class as indicative of an identity crisis felt by many, quote, Negroes of the new era, caught between desire for acceptance by white America and Black pride. Absolutely. I forgot to offer true or false underneath that one. But that was conveyed by me. The Scopes trial, right? Mr. Scopes took on a challenge from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, protecting, right, the Bill of Rights for oftentimes minority individuals, right, throughout the country. In the Bible Belt, including Tennessee, local school boards began passing laws that macro species evolution, the idea that we have evolved from a different species as human beings, from a primate of some sort, they would prohibit their teachers from teaching this theory to their kids. And for obvious reasons, as you would imagine, from a religious environment, right, and culture in the Bible Belt, is for one, it challenges the Genesis account in the Bible that man created animals and created man distinctively. So hence, if the Bible's wrong on Genesis, what else could it be wrong on? And then hence the idea that if you can't trust what the Bible says, then maybe there is no moral accountability to this Judeo-Christian God, and hence you can live however you like. There was a reverend named Amzie Dixon who went on a big speaking tour saying that all hell was going to break loose in the schools if kids were taught that they were no different, but just further evolved from the primates and not created in the image of God and morally accountable to that God for what they do and don't do, etc. So at any rate, the instructor argued that it should have involved the legal issues of authority over curriculum and goals and limitations regarding academic liberty. And he demonstrated that it was indeed was focused upon. That one is false. All of it is true until the end. That is not what they focused upon. It became a circus, as you see in the next couple. The atmosphere, according to the instructor, quickly became circus-like as arrivals brought antics, hyperbole, and drama to the Tennessee town. And ACLU attorney Clarence Darrow publicly questioned the veracity of biblical passages, thus instigating a quasi-holy war amidst an educational issue. That happened. Okay. And then C, the court defended the school district's right to fire Mr. Scopes for teaching the theory of evolution to biology students at this Tennessee high school, public school. But the press depicted the town and the traditionalist as, quote, backward. And that is true also. So one that was false was the first one. It was right. It was intended to be correct until the end of it. That it should have involved issues of authority over curriculum, goals, limitations regarding academic liberty, but that was not which was focused upon. All right. And then notice your last three questions. I need you to look those up, okay? Usually by the test 2 and 3, I just have a few on each of them straight from the textbook. But by test 2 and 3, I expect you guys to do it, to study it and to know the questions, to discern the answer to it yourselves. So notice which you will be asked. Alan Brinkley fails to include in his introduction of From Crisis to Empire, is the name of his chapter, an economic depression and domestic, social, and political problems as relevant to overseas imperialism. Is that true? So look at your introduction in his chapter From Crisis to Empire and see if he does include as relevant context an economic depression and domestic, social, and political problems as relevant context to the Spanish-American War and overseas imperialism. Number 39, two primary aims of the progressives, according to Alan Brinkley's introduction in the textbook to the progressive movement, were justice and order. So that'll be easy to discern. Just look at the introduction and see if that's the case. And number 40, Alan Brinkley in the New Era chapter on the Roaring 20s attributes the 1924 Immigration Act and its leniency to progressive acceptance of non-WASP minorities during the 20s. Is that true or not? Look at the 1924 National Origins Act and see just how lenient it may or may not have been. Okay. So ladies, I'm going to give you 10 rather than 5 points for sticking with me today. I appreciate that. That's it for me. Are there any concluding questions that you have before we say adieu?
No, thank you.
You're welcome, Joanna. Okay. All right, ladies. Well, thank you. I appreciate your attendance. I really do. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Cowell.
You're very welcome. Appreciate you.